Well, aside from working on the exit poll, some of you may know I've been following the prospects of the Purple People for a while and wrote a book about them last year, which got a fair amount of debate going. So I thought I would use this as an opportunity to look back on how they did in 2015, how their performance tallied up against their expectations, and what the challenges will be for Ukip going forward. So to start with their overall performance, in terms of vote share, Ukip did extraordinarily well. Dan Hodges wrote a piece in 2013 promising to bicycle naked through Whitehall wearing a Nigel Farage mask if Ukip got more than 7%. They ended up getting nearly double that. I'm not sure if he's yet followed through on his pledge. I hope not for the sake of people who have to work in Whitehall. This is the largest rise in vote share for any party, GB-wide vote share, incidentally, because, of course, the SNP did far better than that in Scotland. The largest GB-wide vote share increase since the SDP Liberal Alliance in Peter Mandelson's first election of 1983. It is the best performance by a party other than Conservatives, Labour and Lib Dems nationwide ever, without exception. Over 4 million votes in total across Great Britain. I don't think they stood in Northern Ireland. Yet all of this extraordinary surge in support delivered just a single MP. It used to be said of the Lib Dems in the 1950s that you could fit them all into the back of one hackney cab. Now, with 8 MPs, they probably need 2, whereas Douglas Carswell just needs his bicycle. That's the whole UKIP parliamentary contingent. The possible silver lining for that is the silver medals that they got, 120 second places, which is more than I expected them to get. It's more, I think, than even they expected to get. And those break down fairly evenly between the two main parties. 76 of UKIP's second places are in Conservative-held seats and 54 in Labour-held seats. So they are now in a position to present themselves as the local party of opposition in a large number of English seats. And that may perhaps provide them with some comfort. Now, where did they do well? Well, really, the pattern of UKIP performance was not very surprising at all for me as somebody who's been studying the kind of voters that they get. They did very well in seats where you had a large concentration of what we in the book called the left behind electorate. Older, white working class voters with few educational qualifications living in economically declining and geographically isolated areas, particularly along the east coast of England, all the way up from the northeast right the way down to Thanet on the tip of Kent. Even after accounting for the demographics of areas, though, they did even better along that east coast stretch than we can account for just by the kind of people who live there. So there does seem to be some kind of undefined east coast effect that UKIP just seem to be more popular in that part of England. They seem to be weaker in the northwest as well, where we are here. And again, that doesn't seem to be accounted for by the kind of demographics that typically predict their performance. We don't know why. Interestingly, I've long characterised the UKIP, non-UKIP divide in the electorate as being a kind of London versus un-London divide, because all the kind of demographics that characterise London tend to be the kind of things that UKIP react against, and the kind of voters who live in London tend to be the kind of voters UKIP don't win. Young people, graduates, ethnic minorities, people who are doing well economically and so on. However, if you control for all that, the so-called left-behind voters who are still in London, in places like Barking or Dagenham, went to UKIP even more strongly than voters elsewhere. So perhaps the experience of being left out of this big dynamic city performance made the UKIP appeal even stronger there than it would have been elsewhere. In terms of the constituency level predictors of UKIP support, attitudinally, and this I think is very important for what's coming, views of immigration were a far stronger predictor of constituency-level UKIP support than views of the EU. Indeed, when you control for views of immigration, views of the EU aren't even a significant predictor of UKIP support at all. UKIP is very much more, in terms of the people voting for it, very much more about immigration and national identity than it is about the EU. In terms of where they the strong performance is clustered in terms of where are the battlegrounds going to be, to the extent that there are battlegrounds in 2020. Around the Thames Estuary and around the Wash, you get a big arc of very strong UKIP performances. Of course, Mr Farage was along that stretch, and also Mr Carswell. More surprisingly, South and West Yorkshire and the North East. So the first two were what everyone was expecting based on the argument that UKIP were primarily going to hurt the Conservatives because they're mostly Conservative-held seats in those areas. The latter two were the areas where UKIP are primarily posing a threat to Labour. There was some evidence already emerging about the South and West Yorkshire cluster of UKIP support. The North East came as a surprise to me, actually. We weren't expecting necessarily UKIP to do that well up there. They weren't really sending many activists up there. It's right up at the other end of the country from where their strongest targets were, and yet there it was on the night. So I've contributed quite a lot to various discussions about who UKIP hurt. I don't think that that issue is by any means definitively resolved yet, but one piece of interesting indicative evidence from the constituency level performances is when you compare how the parties did in the seats where UKIP growth was weakest, which is the sort of lavender ones here, with their performance in the seats where UKIP growth was strongest. So in the weakest UKIP seats, the Conservatives were up 2 points and Labour were up 6 points on average. That's the seats where UKIP grew by less than 8%. In the strongest UKIP seats, the Conservatives lost 1 point on average, whereas Labour was up just 1.5 points. So the difference in performance, which is one way of trying to just get an initial cut on what the UKIP effect might have been, but of course it could have been driven by many other things, was larger for Labour than the Conservatives. The Conservatives did 3 points worse in the seats where UKIP did best. Labour did 4.5 points worse in the seats where UKIP did best. Incidentally, the Lib Dems did slightly less badly where UKIP did best. I've no idea why that might be. It's a bit mystifying, but it wasn't like it was going to save them. It was still a 14-point drop. But so there does seem to be a bigger correlation between UKIP and Labour performance at the constituency level than between UKIP and Conservative performance. But that's the constituency level, not the individual level. It could have just been that a lot of Conservative voters in Labour-held seats all went over to UKIP, perhaps because they didn't think the Conservatives could win, as Jane was talking about. In terms of their strongest performances, here's the top 10. Clacton up at the top there, where Douglas Carswell won. Next, after that, Boston and Skegness, which, when you look at the demographics, is possibly one of the most ideal UKIP seats. And I think if Mr Farage could go back in the DeLorean for 2 years ago and choose where to stand, he might have done better to stand there. Instead, they chose to stand a 22-year-old political novice, and possibly as a result missed out on their best chance of getting a seat. Then we have Thanet South, where Farage came close, but not close enough. Then Hayward and Middleton, where UKIP had a strong by-election performance ahead of time. Then we have Thurrock and Castle Point along the Thames Estuary, Rochester and Stroud, the second defection seat, where Mark Reckless couldn't hold on, which seemed to please David Cameron so much that he took a photograph of himself next to the new Conservative MP, where there was the whole new cohort and he was there with them. The one he put right next to him was the one who kicked out Mark Reckless. I think that says something. Then we have Rotherham and Rother Valley, where of course there was a major local government scandal, and the entire Rotherham Council has now been given the boot, providing UKIP with an interesting opportunity in local government shortly. And at number 9, Dagenham and Rainham, the home constituency of John Cruddas, one of the people who's been most vocal on the issue of Labour's fraying connections with traditional white working class voters. Well, this is now a problem that he's very much one he's going to have to deal with as a personal level, because UKIP are now just about 15 points behind him in Dagenham and Rainham. It was one of their strongest performances. So where will UKIP target in 2020? I'm going to split this into Conservative-held targets and Labour-held targets. The first thing to notice on both of these slides is that UKIP don't have many marginal seats to compete for. There are only about less than 10 seats where the UKIP, the majority over UKIP is less than, say, 15 points. So they still have to make big swings in order to make even more than a few gains. And in many cases, they're going to have to come from third place, which makes it even harder for them. All of this points to essentially a total dead loss in terms of their target seats campaign, because they haven't set up a set of seats where they can easily just make the final push over the edge to get the seat. They still have a big mountain to climb in most of these places. Take Plymouth Moor View, which went from Labour to the Conservatives. They're 16 points behind the Conservatives and in third place, and that's the fifth most marginal Conservative-held seat with a UKIP challenger. So aside from Thurrock and Thanet and possibly Boston and Skegness, it's hard to see realistically many of these necessarily going at the next election. When we look at the Labour-held targets, the number one seat might be one that Lord Mandelson is familiar with. It's the seat he represented, Hartlepool, where UKIP...
This happened in my day.
Well, I would refer you to chapter 3 of the book and just leave it
You've got a sale.
So UKIP are currently 7.7 points behind Lord Mandelson's successor, who was quite rude about me when I said that UKIP might do well in his seat. Maybe he'll be politer now. And then after that, we have Hayward and Middleton, where they did so well in the by-election. Again, something, an idea about which multitudes of scorn was poured before it happened. And then John Cruddus' seat of Dagenham and Rainham, about a 6-point swing to UKIP now required for Cruddus to lose his seat. You'll notice, though, that there's a pattern to all of these seats. Aside from Dagenham and Rainham, they're mainly declining seats in the north of England and a couple in the West Midlands as well. And the other thing I would draw your attention to actually on both of these slides is this last column, which shows you the share of votes for the other main party. Because for UKIP to get over the top, they don't necessarily have to win votes from the party that's currently incumbent. If they can pitch themselves as the local opposition, they can squeeze down this other main party's vote, much as the Lib Dems used to do. And here, I think, is where, going through to 2020, UKIP could pose more of a challenge to Labour than the Conservatives, because it is the very fact that Conservatives are more willing to vote UKIP that makes them more of a threat in these kinds of seats. Because look at the share that you've got to squeeze down. In both cases, it can be 20, 30% of the vote available to squeeze. If in Hartlepool, UKIP managed to get over half the remaining Conservative votes, they win without having to persuade a single Labour voter to switch over to them. So if they are more appealing to Conservative voters in Hartlepool or Hayward or Dagenham, then Labour have a real problem. Because even if they hold on to the vote that they have right now, if the right vote consolidates behind UKIP's banner, they lose seats. And that's where I think the challenge for them will be going forward. But I want to say a little bit about the challenges ahead for UKIP to finish. The first one is the referendum. Oscar Wilde said there are only two tragedies in life. One is not getting what you want and the other is getting it. A lot of UKIP people have built their political careers around the idea of getting a referendum, and it's now causing them all sorts of headaches. The first being the so-called UKIP paradox. It seems to be that the more the case for leaving the EU is associated with UKIP, the less popular it becomes. Because the kind of moderate voters you need to win over to get to 51% in a referendum of the whole nation are not the kind of voters who are in that 13% who are attracted to UKIP. They are much more like the kind of voters that Peter Mandelson was talking about you need to win elections. Moderate, not necessarily that engaged with ideological disputes and so on, but engaged on issues of competence and the economy and so on. And if these voters get the idea that, you know, basically the case for out is Nigel Farage and UKIP, they'll think, well, that doesn't look like the kind of thing that I want to endorse. That looks a bit alarming to me. I think I'll shy away from that. But it's a tricky thing for them, because all of the people in UKIP, this is their definitional issue. So it's not easy to say to them, you should be less prominently involved with this campaign because you're bad for it, because that's all they want to be involved with for the next 2 years. How do you tell them to sort of be quiet and go home for a bit? The other issue is what happens after the vote. Regardless of the result, it's kind of an identity crisis for UKIP. If the British people vote to stay, UKIP will be tearing themselves apart over why did we fail? We had this great opportunity to finally get what we want and we failed. Why did that happen? If the vote is to leave, then many of the major people who fund UKIP and many of the people who run the party will say, well, that's it, job done, go home. Don't need to do anything further. Whereas there is a section of UKIP who want to be a domestic political force and want UKIP to be about more than just this issue of the EU. But then there's another difficult argument to have, Second challenge for UKIP is party building. I got an awful lot of phone calls in the week after the election was done, not to talk about the exit poll, but to talk about this strange soap opera of the unresignation. As one Belgian MP in the European Parliament put it, Nigel Farage handed his resignation letter in to Nigel Farage, and Nigel Farage refused it. So it was pretty bizarre. It was also par for the course for UKIP, who it's a kind of a tradition for them after every general election to have some major row. So they fulfilled that tradition, I think, amply well this time, leaving people with the impression that Nigel Farage is something of an autocratic leader, and there's clearly a lot of discontent there. WWDD, what will Douglas do? Douglas Carswell's their only remaining MP. He clearly didn't like this process. He is a believer, and I think a sincere believer in internal party democracy. That wasn't what was on display. And he's been making noises of increasing disgruntlement with the party in general. So we have to wonder if UKIP can actually manage the unprecedented feat of going from one to none MPs if Douglas were to leave and become, say, an independent. Their target seat strategy, of which they made much in the election campaign, can't be described as anything other than a total dead loss. They have to ask themselves some really searching questions about why that was. Why were they not able to get from 33% to 40%, the point at which you actually win seats? Why did they come so close so often and yet not get that final push? So that's the challenge ahead. They need a more united, more competent leadership, an ability to reach out to more moderate voters. But a big obstacle for them there is their activist base. The problem with UKIP activists, which you'll know if you speak to them much on the internet like I do, they don't really understand that 87% of the country don't think like UKIP, and that simply telling them that they should think like UKIP isn't much of a way to persuade them to do so. So they have to try and find some way to channel their activists into a kind of a more inclusive direction. If they're going to solve that electoral credibility problem. Which brings me on to the third challenge, yeah, I'm nearly done, which is winning elections. Nothing succeeds like success. If you want to tell the voters of a particular constituency that you're a credible election-winning challenger, it helps if you've actually won elections in the area, particularly, say, in local council elections and so on. So the big next challenge for UKIP in terms of recovering from the setback of 2015 is the 2016 local elections, including elections in a lot of northern metro areas where UKIP are now second place to Labour, elections in the Welsh Assembly where UKIP are in much polling now already in second place and where they'll aim to become the main opposition party to Labour in Wales, elections to the London Assembly where UKIP will be looking to sort of solve the London problem, prove they can appeal to a broader electorate. I haven't included the Scottish Parliament in that because I think even the most hardcore UKIP activists would accept at this point that they really don't have a hope in Scotland of getting anywhere. The problem for UKIP in these new election campaigns is there's several things. Firstly, the return of the Lib Dems to opposition and the absolute kicking they got in being returned to opposition means that the Lib Dems are now more credible as a potential source for moderate protest voters. The Lib Dems can more easily portray themselves as once again being outsiders and so on and so forth. It was remarkable how many members they picked up in the week after the election result, which seems to suggest that the electorate feel that they've now suffered enough, that the appropriate verdict has been given on this. And so I do think when you take a party that has an incredibly strong track record of winning disaffected voters from across the political spectrum, running effective local campaigns, this will be much more of a problem for UKIP now that the Lib Dems aren't bound into government. We also have a Conservative majority government, which in terms of UKIP campaigns in northern metro areas is a bad thing because they're not going to be so easily able to pick up disaffected Labour voters because they won't be so disaffected when they're in a situation of opposition rather than in a situation of government. And the third big problem, of course, coming back to the referendum thing, is that most UKIP activists are not going to want to talk to local people about dog poo on the streets and speed bumps and all the rest of it because they're going to be out there fighting their big existential referendum campaign. So it's going to be a major distraction for them in terms of how do you concentrate resources on these local elections that could matter for the party building element of the party when there's this massive referendum going on that's going to be the issue they all want to deal with. So to sum up, 2015 can't really be seen as much other than a missed opportunity for UKIP. If you achieve the biggest ever increase in vote share for a minor party and manage only one seat, and that seat a defector from another party, that's a big failure to capitalise, in my view. Now, the electoral system was harsh on the party, that's true, but they knew what the electoral system was going to be going into this election, and I think they failed to actually run a campaign that reflected the reality of the electorates they had to win rather than the electorates they wanted to win. They were too polarising, they made very little effort to woo moderates, their local campaigns seemed to have been very poorly organised, and towards the end it seemed to be a case of everybody being pulled into Thanet to try and save the leader, an effort which of course ultimately was doomed as well, but may well have cost them seats elsewhere. However, they do still go into the next election cycle stronger than they were. Local opposition in over 100 seats, and we can be sure that the EU is going to be top of the agenda for the next couple of years. But they remain vulnerable despite that. They're still internally divided and conflict-prone. They still have a lot of eccentric activists. They now have to compete with a recovering Liberal Democrat Party for the mid-Dem protest vote, and they don't have many genuine marginals going into the next general election. And if they want to build genuine marginals, they're going to need to get stronger in local government, but the referendum is going to disrupt that process. So perhaps in 2020 we'll say, well, that was their chance and they blew it. Don't know.